The words hung in the air between them like a bridge. Neither was ready to cross. Matthew Rogers sat on the edge of the couch, his hands trembling as he stared at the floor, while Adam James stood frozen by the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. The confession had spilled out of Matthew like water through a broken dam, raw and desperate, and years in the making. "I said I didn't feel right around anyone else," Matthew whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet apartment. "And then I told you that you were the exception." Adam's breath fogged the window as he pressed his forehead against the cool glass. 3 simple sentences had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about his best friend, about himself, about the careful distance they'd maintained for so long. The world had tilted on its axis, and he was still trying to find his footing. "Adam, please say something." The desperation in Matthew's voice cut through Adam like a knife. He turned slowly, meeting those familiar brown eyes that now held a vulnerability he'd never seen before. Matthew looked like he was bracing for impact, every muscle tense with the anticipation of rejection. "How long?" Adam's voice came out rougher than he intended. Matthew's laugh was hollow, bitter. "How long have I been lying to myself? Or how long have I known I was in love with you?" The word love landed between them like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples through everything they'd carefully constructed. Adam felt his chest tighten, felt the air grow thick with possibility and terror. Matthew closed his eyes, and Adam watched as a single tear traced down his cheek. Quote sent. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story is about to take you on an emotional journey that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love and friendship. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how 2 best friends found themselves standing on the precipice of something that could either destroy or transform everything they'd built together, we need to go back. Back to the beginning, when Matthew Rogers first realized that the ache in his chest whenever Adam smiled at someone else wasn't the protective instinct of a good friend, but something far more dangerous and infinitely more precious. It had started, as most life-changing realizations do, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in their shared apartment. Matthew had been making coffee, going through the familiar motions of measuring grounds and adding water, when Adam had emerged from his bedroom wearing nothing but sleep pants and a lazy smile. The morning light streaming through the kitchen window had caught the golden flecks in Adam's green eyes, and Matthew had felt something shift inside his chest, something that made his hands shake as he reached for the sugar. Stubborn. Adam had mumbled, his voice still thick with sleep as he patted across the cold tile floor. He'd moved to stand beside Matthew at the counter, close enough that Matthew could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, could smell the faint scent of his shampoo mixed with something uniquely Adam. "Morning," Matthew had managed to reply, his voice coming out steadier than he felt. He'd been hyper-aware of every inch of space between them, of the way Adam's shoulder occasionally brushed against his as they moved around each other in the familiar dance of their morning routine. It should have been normal. It had been normal for the 3 years they'd been roommates, for the 5 years they'd been best friends. But that morning, something had been different. That morning, Matthew had found himself cataloging the way Adam's hair stuck up at odd angles, the way he rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand like a sleepy child, the unconscious grace in his movements as he reached for his favorite mug from the top shelf. And then Adam had smiled at him, that slow, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and Matthew had felt his world rearrange itself around this new, terrifying truth. He was in love with his best friend. He was in love with Adam James, and the realization hit him with the force of a freight train. Quote 9. Adam had asked, his brow furrowing with concern as he studied Matthew's face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Matthew had forced a laugh, had made some excuse about not sleeping well, but the damage was done. The truth was out there now, living and breathing in the space between them, even if only Matthew could see it. He'd spent the rest of that day in a daze, replaying every interaction they had ever had, recontextualizing years of friendship through this new lens of understanding. The weeks that followed had been a special kind of torture. Matthew had found himself hyper-aware of everything Adam did, every casual touch, every shared laugh, every moment of comfortable silence. He'd started noticing things he'd somehow missed before, like the way Adam's eyes lingered on his face when he thought Matthew wasn't looking, or the way he always seemed to find excuses to be close, to touch Matthew's arm when he was making a point, or to sit just a little too close on the couch during their movie nights. But Matthew had also become acutely aware of all the ways Adam talked about women, about his dates and his relationships and his casual hookups. Adam James was straight, had always been straight, had never given any indication that he might be anything other than straight. And Matthew had resigned himself to loving someone who could never love him back, had learned to live with the constant ache of wanting something he couldn't have. He'd gotten good at hiding it, or so he thought. He'd perfected the art of the supportive friend, had listened with apparent interest as Adam complained about his latest girlfriend or celebrated a new conquest. He'd offered advice when asked, had been the shoulder to cry on when relationships ended badly, had played the role of the understanding best friend so well that sometimes he almost convinced himself it was real. But late at night, when the apartment was quiet and Adam was asleep in the room next to his, Matthew would lie awake and let himself imagine what it would be like if things were different. He'd picture Adam's hands in his hair, Adam's lips against his neck, Adam's voice whispering his name in the darkness. He'd imagine what it would feel like to be able to touch him freely, to kiss him good morning, to fall asleep tangled together in the same bed. And then morning would come, and Matthew would push those thoughts away and slip back into his carefully constructed role. He'd make coffee and pretend his heart didn't skip when Adam smiled at him. He'd listen to stories about dates and pretend each one didn't feel like a knife twisting in his chest. He'd be the perfect friend, because being Adam's friend was better than not being in his life at all. The turning point had come 6 months ago, on a Friday night that had started like any other. Adam had been getting ready for a date with some woman he'd met at work, and Matthew had been trying very hard to seem interested and supportive as Adam debated between two shirts. Early 11. Adam had asked, holding up a blue button-down and a black polo. Bueno. Matthew had looked at him, really looked at him, and had felt that familiar ache settle in his chest. Adam had been nervous, he'd realized, in a way that was unusual for him. His hands had been slightly unsteady as he held up the shirts, and there had been something in his expression that Matthew couldn't quite identify. Cornwall and Matthew had said because it brought out Adam's own eyes, because it fit him perfectly, because it made him look devastating in a way that some other woman was going to get to appreciate. Definitely the blue one. Adam had smiled, that brilliant smile that never failed to make Matthew's heart race, and had pulled on the shirt. Matthew had watched him button it up, had noticed the way his fingers fumbled slightly with the cuffs, and had felt an overwhelming urge to reach out and help him. Hodar 15. Matthew had observed, trying to keep his tone light and teasing. Adam had paused in his movements, his hands stilling on the buttons. Hot 16. But it hadn't been just dinner, and they'd both known it. Adam had been talking about this woman for weeks, had seemed genuinely excited about her in a way that was different from his usual casual approach to dating. Matthew had listened to every story, had absorbed every detail about Lisa Ross and her job at the marketing firm, and her love of hiking, and her infectious laugh. Quote chapter 17. Matthew had said, and had immediately hated himself for the way his voice had caught on the words. Adam had looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment something had passed between them that Matthew couldn't name. Adam's expression had softened, had become almost tender, and Matthew had felt his breath catch in his throat. Adam had said quietly, "Quote 19," and then he'd left, and Matthew had spent the evening alone in their apartment, trying not to think about Adam charming another woman, trying not to imagine him kissing someone else, trying not to picture him falling in love with someone who wasn't Matthew. Adam had come home late that night, and Matthew had pretended to be asleep when he heard the front door open. He'd listened to Adam moving around the apartment, had heard him brush his teeth and get ready for bed, and had held his breath when Adam had paused outside his bedroom door. For a moment, Matthew had thought Adam might knock, might come in and tell him about the date, but after a long pause, he'd heard Adam's footsteps continue down the hall to his own room. The next morning, Adam had been quiet over breakfast, almost subdued. Matthew had waited for him to volunteer information about the date, but Adam had seemed lost in thought, stirring his coffee absently and staring out the window with an expression Matthew couldn't read. Chapter 20, Matthew had finally said, trying to keep his voice casual. Quote 20. Adam had looked up at him, and Matthew had been surprised by the confusion in his eyes. Quote 21. Adam had said, but there had been something in his tone that suggested it had been anything but fine. Quote 20. Adam had been quiet for a long moment, and Matthew had watched him struggle with something, had seen the way his jaw tightened and released as he seemed to weigh his words. Quote 20. Adam had finally said, quote 20, the past tense hadn't been lost on Matthew. But nothing felt right. Adam had looked down at his coffee, his brow furrowed. I kept waiting for that spark, that moment when everything clicks into place, but it never came. Matthew had felt something twist in his chest, a complicated mix of relief and sympathy, and something else he hadn't wanted to examine too closely. Quote 29 he'd offered, because that's what a good friend would say. Adam had looked at him again, and this time there had been something almost desperate in his expression. Quote 30. The question had hit Matthew like a physical blow. How do you know? You know when their smile makes your chest tight with joy. You know when the thought of them with someone else makes you want to break things. You know when you'd rather spend a quiet evening with them than a wild night with anyone else. You know when you love them so much it feels like it might kill you. But Matthew hadn't said any of that. Instead, he'd given some generic advice about compatibility and shared values and taking things slow. He'd watched Adam nod thoughtfully, had seen him file away the words like they might actually be helpful, and had hated himself for his cowardice. Adam had continued seeing Lisa Ross for another month, but Matthew had been able to tell that his heart wasn't in it. He'd stopped talking about her with the same enthusiasm, had stopped seeming nervous before their dates. When he'd finally told Matthew that they'd decided to just be friends, Matthew had tried very hard to seem appropriately sympathetic rather than relieved. Quote 31. Adam had said that night, sprawled on their couch with a beer in his hand and frustration written across his features. Quote 30. Quote 30. Matthew had suggested settling onto the opposite end of the couch with his own beer. Adam had turned to look at Ian, and Matthew had felt that familiar flutter in his chest at the intensity of his gaze. It was such a loaded question, and Matthew had felt the weight of all the words he couldn't say pressing against his throat. Me, he'd wanted to answer. I am. I've been here all along loving you in ways you can't even imagine, and I would be so good to you if you'd just let me. Instead, he'd taken a long sip of his beer and had tried to think of something helpful and platonic to say. He'd admitted, but I think you'll know it when you find it. Adam had been quiet for a long moment, and when he'd spoken again, his voice had been softer, more thoughtful. Matthew's heart had started racing, and he'd gripped his beer bottle tighter to hide the way his hands had begun to shake. Quote 38 bis. Matthew had wanted to scream. Yes, I feel that way every single day when I look at you. Every moment we spend together feels like coming home. Every smile you give me feels like a gift I don't deserve. You are my person, and you have been for longer than I can remember. Yeah, he'd said instead, his voice barely above a whisper. Quote 41. Adam had leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. Quote 42. And Matthew had panicked. He'd mumbled something about a girl from college, had made up a story about a relationship that had ended badly, had deflected and changed the subject as quickly as he could. But he'd seen something in Adam's expression as he told his lie, something that looked almost like disappointment. That conversation had marked a shift in their dynamic, though Matthew hadn't understood it at the time. Adam had become more attentive, more physically affectionate, more likely to seek out Matthew's company even when he had other options. He'd started suggesting they spend more time together, just the two of them, and had seemed genuinely disappointed when Matthew had other plans. It had been confusing and wonderful and torturous all at once. Matthew had found himself living for those moments when Adam would fall asleep against his shoulder during movie nights, when Adam would absently play with his fingers while they talked, when Adam would look at him with such warmth and affection that Matthew had to remind himself that it was just friendship, that it didn't mean what his heart wanted it to mean. And then, 3 weeks ago, everything had changed again. Adam had come home from another unsuccessful date, this one with a woman named Angela Martin, who worked at the coffee shop they frequented. Matthew had been reading in the living room when Adam had walked through the door, and he'd looked up to find Adam standing in the entryway with the strangest expression on his face. "How was it?" Matthew had asked, though he'd already known from Adam's expression that it hadn't gone well. Adam had walked over to the couch and had collapsed beside Matthew close enough that their thighs had touched. "Care," he'd said, his voice serious in a way that had made Matthew's stomach clench with anxiety. Quote, and Adam had turned to face him, and Matthew had been struck by the intensity in his green eyes. Quote 46. The question had caught Matthew completely off guard. Quote counter to quote on Adam had said, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Quote Matthew had felt his chest tighten with a sympathy and something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. Quote after. Quote Adam had asked, and his voice had been so quiet that Matthew had almost missed the words. Quote 52. Matthew's heart had started racing, and he'd found himself leaning closer without conscious thought. At 53, Adam had looked at him for a long moment, and Matthew had felt like he was drowning in those green eyes. Quote 54. The words had hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and terrifying in their implications. Matthew had felt his breath catch, had felt the world narrow down to just this moment, just the two of them on their couch with the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them. Matthew had whispered, not sure what he was going to say, not sure if he was brave enough to say anything at all. But Adam had pulled back then, had shaken his head as if clearing it of some unwelcome thought. He'd said, his voice returning to its normal tone, "I'm just frustrated. Ignore me." But Matthew couldn't ignore him. He couldn't ignore the way Adam had looked at him, couldn't ignore the implication in his words, couldn't ignore the way his own heart had soared with hope before crashing back down to earth. That night had marked the beginning of 3 weeks of the most exquisite torture Matthew had ever experienced. Adam had become even more physically affectionate, more likely to find excuses to touch Matthew, to sit close to him, to linger in doorways when Matthew was getting ready for bed. He'd started asking strange questions, hypothetical scenarios that had felt anything but hypothetical. He'd asked one evening as they'd cooked dinner together. Quote 59. He'd wondered aloud during a commercial break. "Have you ever wondered what it would be like to kiss a guy?" he'd asked one night when they'd both had too much wine, and Matthew had nearly choked on his drink. Each question had felt like a test, like Adam was trying to gauge Matthew's reaction, trying to figure out something he couldn't quite articulate. And Matthew had tried to be supportive and open-minded in his responses while his heart had hammered against his ribs with the possibility that maybe, just maybe, Adam was questioning things too. But it had been the conversation 2 nights ago that had finally pushed them both over the edge. They'd been sitting on their couch, ostensibly watching a movie but really just talking, when Adam had gone quiet in the middle of a sentence. Matthew had looked over to find Adam staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. "What?" Matthew had asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Can I ask you something personal?" Matthew had nodded, though his heart had started racing with anticipation and dread. "That guy you mentioned, the one from college, the one who was your person." Adam's voice had been careful, measured. Quote 64. Matthew had felt the blood drain from his face. He'd forgotten about the lie he'd told, the fictional relationship he'd invented to avoid talking about his real feelings. Now Adam was asking for details he couldn't provide because the relationship had never existed. Matthew had said, trying to buy time while his mind raced. "Pashayer." Adam had shifted on the couch, turning to face Matthew more fully, and Matthew had been trapped by the earnestness in his expression. He'd opened his mouth to continue the lie, to elaborate on the fictional relationship, but something in Adam's eyes had stopped him. Matthew had said slowly, Adam's brow had furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean there was no guy from college. I made that up." "Wait, don't." And that had been the question Matthew had been dreading, because answering it honestly would mean confessing everything, would mean risking their friendship and potentially losing the most important person in his life. Because the truth was too complicated to explain, Matthew had said finally. Adam had been quiet for a long moment, and Matthew had watched emotions flicker across his face too quickly to identify. When he'd finally spoken, his voice had been soft, almost tentative. Quote 73. Those 2 words had been Matthew's undoing. There had been something in Adam's tone, something in his expression, that had made Matthew feel like maybe, just maybe, the truth wouldn't destroy everything they'd built together. Quote 74. Matthew had said, his voice barely above a whisper. Quote 7. Adam's breath had caught audibly. Matthew, I know it's not what you want to hear. Matthew had rushed on, the words spilling out of him like water through a broken dam. I know it complicates everything, and I know it's not fair to you, but I can't pretend anymore. I can't keep lying about who I am and what I want. What are you saying? Matthew had looked at him then, really looked at him, and had seen something in Adam's eyes that looked like hope mixed with terror. It had given him the courage to say the words that had been burning in his chest for months. Quote 80. The silence that had followed had been deafening. Matthew had watched Adam's face cycle through shock, confusion, and something else that had looked dangerously like relief. When Adam had finally spoken, his voice had been shaky. You're gay? I don't know, Matthew had admitted. I've never really thought about labels. All I know is that I'm in love with you, and I have been for longer than I can remember. Adam had closed his eyes, and Matthew had seen his hands tremble slightly in his lap. This explains so much, he'd whispered. 85. Adam had opened his eyes and had looked at Matthew with such intensity that Matthew had felt like he was being seen for the first time in years. Quote, Matthew's heart had started racing. What way? Like I can't breathe when you're not here. Like nothing feels real unless you're experiencing it with me. Like every woman I date is missing something essential, something I can only find with you. The words had hit Matthew like a physical blow, and he'd felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Get a bait time to call 98. Adam had continued, his voice growing stronger. Quote 91. 92. Adam had laughed, but it had been a sound without humor. They'd stared at each other across the small space of the couch, both breathing hard, both looking like they were on the verge of either running or closing the distance between them. The air had been thick with possibility and terror and years of unspoken longing. So what do we do now? Matthew had asked. Adam had been quiet for a long moment, and Matthew had watched him struggle with something internal, had seen the moment when decision had crystallized in his expression. I don't know, Adam had said finally, but I know I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way. I can't keep dating other people and wondering why they don't make me feel the way you do. And how do I make you feel? Adam had leaned closer then, close enough that Matthew had been able to see the gold flecks in his green eyes, close enough to feel his breath against his cheek. Like I'm home, Adam had whispered. Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. That had been 2 nights ago, and they'd spent the time since then in a strange sort of limbo, both of them hyper-aware of the shift between them, but not sure how to navigate it. They'd been more careful around each other, more conscious of every touch and every look, as if they were both afraid that one wrong move might shatter the fragile new understanding they'd reached. But the tension had been building, the weight of unspoken possibilities growing heavier with each passing hour. Matthew had caught Adam staring at him more than once, had seen something hungry and uncertain in his expression that had made Matthew's pulse race. And he'd been equally guilty of watching Adam, of cataloging every gesture and expression, of wondering what it would feel like to finally close the distance between them, which brought them to tonight, to the conversation that had finally pushed them both over the edge. Adam had been restless all evening, pacing around the apartment like a caged animal, and Matthew had been able to feel his nervous energy from across the room. Quote 100. Adam had said finally, stopping in front of where Matthew sat on the couch. Matthew had looked up at him, had seen the determination in his expression mixed with something that looked like fear. Quote 100 woman. Adam had sat down beside him, close enough that their knees had touched, and Matthew had felt electricity shoot through him at the contact. Quote 1. Adam had taken a deep breath, had looked directly into Matthew's eyes. I said I was confused about my feelings, that I'd never felt this way about a guy before, but that's not entirely true. Matthew had felt his heart skip a beat. What do you mean? I mean, I have felt this way before. About you. For longer than I want to admit. Adam's voice had been quiet but steady. But answered, quote 1. Adam had smiled, but it had been a sad, self-deprecating expression. Quote one. Matthew had nodded, remembering it vividly, remembering how that had been the morning when everything had changed for him. Quote 11. Adam had paused, had reached out to trace his fingers along Matthew's knuckles. I spent the whole day trying to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just some weird fluke. But then it kept happening. Every time I looked at you, every time you smiled at me, every time we were together. Matthew had stared down at their hands, at the way Adam's fingers were intertwined with his, and had felt like he might cry from the relief of finally hearing these words. Quote 104, Adam had admitted. Adam had lifted their joined hands, had pressed Matthew's knuckles to his lips in a gesture so tender that Matthew had felt his breath catch. Every woman I dated, I found myself comparing to you. Every relationship that didn't work, I told myself it was because they weren't right for me, but the truth was, they weren't you. Matthew had looked up at him then, had seen his own longing reflected in Adam's green eyes. Quote 119, and Adam had been quiet for a moment, and when he'd spoken, his voice had been barely above a whisper. You did. The way you looked at me when you told me you loved me. The way you've been looking at me for the past 2 days, like I'm something precious. Something worth fighting for. He'd paused, had cupped Matthew's face with his free hand. I realized I'd rather be terrified with you than comfortable without you. And that had been the moment when Matthew had finally broken, when 2 years and 7 months of careful control had finally crumbled. He'd surged forward, had closed the distance between them, had pressed his lips to Adam's with all the desperation and longing he'd been carrying for so long. The kiss had been everything Matthew had imagined and nothing like he'd expected. Adam's lips had been soft and warm, and he'd tasted like coffee and possibility. But more than that, he'd kissed Matthew back with a hunger that had stolen Matthew's breath, had threaded his fingers through Matthew's hair, and had pulled him closer like he couldn't bear even the smallest distance between them. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard, Adam had rested his forehead against Matthew's and had smiled the most beautiful smile Matthew had ever seen. Wow, Adam had whispered. Yeah, Matthew had agreed, his voice shaky with emotion. Wow. They'd sat there for a moment, foreheads pressed together, both of them seemingly afraid to move and break the spell. But then Adam had pulled back slightly, had looked into Matthew's eyes with an expression so tender, it had made Matthew's chest ache. Quote 125. Adam had said, and the words had hit Matthew like a physical blow. Quote once, Matthew had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, had felt overwhelmed by the enormity of finally hearing those words from the person he'd never dared hope would say them. Are you sure? Matthew had asked, because he'd needed to hear it again, needed to be certain this wasn't some beautiful dream he was going to wake up from. Adam had smiled, oh no, had leaned in to press another soft kiss to Matthew's lips. Quote 30. Adam had admitted, quote wording in they'd spent the rest of the evenings talking, really talking, for the first time in months without the weight of unspoken truths between them. Adam had told Matthew about the confusion he'd been feeling, about the way he'd started questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. Matthew had shared the agony of the past 2 years, the way he'd tortured himself by staying close to someone he'd thought he could never have. I kept telling myself I was being a good friend, Matthew had said, as they'd curled up together on the couch, Adam's arm around his shoulders and Matthew's head resting against his chest. Quote 100, quote, Adam had said, pressing a kiss to the top of Matthew's head, I'm glad you were braver than I was. It didn't feel brave. It felt like desperation. Adam had tightened his arms around Matthew, had held him closer. Maybe that's what bravery is sometimes. Being so desperate for something real that you're willing to risk everything for it. They'd fallen asleep like that, tangled together on the couch, and Matthew had woken up the next morning with Adam's arms still around him and sunlight streaming through the windows. For a moment, he'd been afraid it had all been a dream, but then Adam had stirred beside him and had smiled at him with such warmth that Matthew had known it was real. Quote 138. Adam had whispered, his voice rough with sleep. Quote 139. Matthew had replied and had leaned up to press a soft kiss to Adam's lips, marveling at the fact that he could do that now, that he was allowed to touch Adam this way. That had been yesterday, and they'd spent the day in a bubble of new intimacy, learning how to be with each other in this new way. They'd made breakfast together, had shared soft kisses over coffee, had spent the afternoon curled up together reading. It had felt natural and right in a way that had made Matthew wonder how they'd ever been anything else. But as evening had approached, Matthew had started to feel the weight of reality pressing in. This was new territory for both of them, and there were so many questions they hadn't addressed yet. What did this mean for their friendship? What did this mean for their living situation? What did this mean for their future? "You're thinking too loud," Adam had said, looking up from his book to study Matthew's face. "What want to?" Matthew had said, trying to shake off his anxiety. "Which for to see?" Adam had set his book aside and had turned to face Matthew fully. "Quote what to?" Matthew had been quiet for a moment, trying to find the words for the fears that had been building in his chest. "Quotes of our to you." Adam had reached out and had taken Matthew's hands in his, had squeezed them gently. "Do you think we've made a mistake?" "No," Matthew had said immediately. "God, no. This feels more right than anything in my entire life." "Then trust that," Adam had said simply. "Trust us." But even as Matthew had nodded, had leaned in to kiss Adam again, he'd felt the fear lingering in the back of his mind. This was too precious, too perfect, too much what he'd always wanted. Surely something would go wrong. Surely the universe wouldn't be this kind to him. Which brought them to tonight, to the moment when all of Matthew's fears had come rushing to the surface in the form of a single panicked confession. He'd been watching Adam make dinner, had been struck by how domestic and perfect it all felt, and suddenly he'd been overwhelmed by the terror that it couldn't last. Quote one fit, Matthew had said, and Adam had looked up from the stove with concern in his eyes. Quote 150 was shown, quote 150, Matthew had admitted, quote 150, Adam had turned off the burner and had moved to stand in front of Matthew, had taken his face in his hands. Quote 154. Matthew had met his eyes, had seen nothing but love and certainty there. Quote 155 on, Adam had said firmly, quote 1 bosh on quote 157. Adam had been quiet for a moment, and Matthew had seen him considering the question seriously. Quoting 158, he'd said finally, but Matthew, what if it does work? What if this is exactly what we're supposed to be doing? And that had been when Matthew had broken down completely, when all the fear and love and desperate hope he'd been carrying had come pouring out of him in a rush of words he hadn't been able to stop. I said I didn't feel right around anyone else, he'd whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. Quote 161. Which brought them full circle, back to this moment, back to Adam turning away from the window and crossing the room to where Matthew sat on the couch. Adam's eyes were bright with unshed tears, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. You are my exception too, he said, sinking down beside Matthew and taking his hands. You are my exception to everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted, about what love was supposed to feel like. Matthew looked at him, really looked at him, and saw his own feelings reflected back at him. The fear was still there, would probably always be there to some degree, but it was overshadowed now by something stronger. Hope, love, the certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. I love you, Matthew said, and this time the words came easily, without fear or reservation. I love you too, Adam replied, and leaned in to kiss him again. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, and more certain. There was no hesitation in it, no fear of crossing a line they couldn't uncross. This was a kiss that spoke of commitment, of choosing each other despite the uncertainty, of being willing to build something new together on the foundation of what they'd already shared. When they broke apart, Adam rested his forehead against Matthew's and smiled. Matthew considered the question, thought about all the unknowns that lay ahead of them. There would be challenges, he knew. They would have to navigate coming out to their friends and families, would have to figure out how to be in a relationship after years of friendship, would have to learn how to love each other in this new way while preserving everything that had made their connection special in the first place. But looking at Adam now, seeing the love and determination in his eyes, Matthew felt a sense of peace settle over him. They would figure it out. They would take it one day at a time, would learn as they went, would build something beautiful together because they both wanted it badly enough to fight for it. Quote 167. Matthew said, echoing Adam's words from the night before, "We take it slow. We communicate. We don't let fear make our decisions for us." Adam nodded, his smile growing wider. "I can live with that." "Good," Matthew said, and leaned in to kiss him again, softer this time, a promise rather than a question. They spent the rest of the evening on the couch talking about practical things and impossible dreams in equal measure. They talked about whether they wanted to tell their friends right away or take some time to adjust to the change themselves. They talked about what it would mean for their living situation, whether they wanted to get a bigger place or just rearrange their current apartment to accommodate their new reality. "I want to do this right," Adam said at one point, his fingers tracing patterns on Matthew's palm. Quote 172. Matthew had laughed at the old-fashioned word, but he'd been touched by the sentiment behind it. "You don't have to court me, Adam. You already have me." "But I want to," Adam had insisted. "I want to take you to dinner, want to bring you flowers, want to hold your hand in public and let everyone know how lucky I am." The image had made Matthew's chest warm with happiness. After years of hiding his feelings, of watching Adam with other people, the idea of being able to claim him publicly felt almost too good to be true. Quote 176. Matthew had said quietly, they'd talked until late into the night, covering everything from the practical to the profound. They'd discussed their fears and their hopes, their expectations and their boundaries. They'd laughed together and cried together and held each other through the overwhelming emotions that came with finally acknowledging what had been building between them for so long. By the time they'd finally gone to bed, Matthew had felt more settled than he had in months. The fear was still there, would probably always be there to some degree, but it was manageable now, overshadowed by excitement and love and the certainty that they were doing the right thing. Adam had walked him to his bedroom door, had kissed him goodnight with a tenderness that had made Matthew's knees weak. "Sweet dreams," he'd whispered against Matthew's lips. "You too," Matthew had replied, and had watched Adam disappear into his own room before closing his door and leaning against it with a smile he couldn't seem to wipe off his face. But sleep had eluded Matthew that night. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he'd replayed the events of the evening, had marveled at how much his life had changed in the span of a few hours. He'd thought about Adam sleeping just down the hall, had wondered if he was lying awake too, processing everything that had happened between them. Around 3 in the morning, Matthew had heard his bedroom door open quietly. He'd turned over to see Adam silhouetted in the doorway, his hair mussed from sleep and uncertainty written across his features. Quote 179. Adam had said softly. Quote 160. Matthew had admitted. Quote 160. Adam had hesitated, had shifted his weight from foot to foot. Quote 182. Matthew had felt his heart melt at the vulnerability in Adam's voice. He'd pulled back the covers and had scooted over to make room. Quote 183. Adam had crossed the room and had slipped into bed beside Matthew, had immediately curled up against his side like he belonged there. Matthew had wrapped his arms around him, had marveled at how perfectly Adam fit against him, how right it felt to hold him this way. Matthew had whispered into the darkness. Quote 185. Adam had replied, his voice already growing heavy with sleep. Quote 186. They had fallen asleep tangled together, and Matthew had woken up the next morning with Adam's head on his chest and sunlight streaming through the windows. He'd lain there for a long time, just watching Adam sleep, memorizing the peaceful expression on his face, the way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheeks, the gentle rhythm of his breathing. When Adam had finally stirred, he'd looked up at Matthew with sleepy green eyes and had smiled. Quote, Matthew had replied, pressing a kiss to the top of Adam's head. "Sleep well?" "Best I've slept in months," Adam had admitted, stretching lazily before settling back against Matthew's chest. Quote, Tom. Matthew had said and had meant it completely. That had been a week ago, and they'd fallen into a new routine with surprising ease. They'd started sleeping in the same bed every night, had begun sharing more intimate touches throughout the day, had slowly started telling their closest friends about the change in their relationship. The responses had been overwhelmingly positive, with most people admitting they'd suspected something was going on between them for months. Finally, and their friend Charles Martinez had said when they'd told him over dinner. Quoted terminated, quote 95. Adam had asked, looking surprised. Charles had laughed. Quote 196. Matthew had felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but Adam had just laughed and had squeezed his hand under the table. Quote 197, quote 98. Charles had confirmed with a grin, but despite the positive reactions from their friends, Matthew had still been struggling with moments of doubt and fear. The transition from friendship to romance hadn't been entirely smooth, and there had been times when he'd wondered if they were moving too fast, if they should have taken more time to adjust to the change. Those doubts had come to a head 3 days ago, when they'd had their first real fight as a couple. It had been about something stupid, something neither of them could even remember afterward. But it had escalated quickly and had left them both feeling raw and uncertain. Maybe we're rushing into this, Matthew had said in the aftermath, his voice thick with emotion. Maybe we should slow down, take some time to figure out what we're doing. Adam had looked at him with such hurt in his eyes that Matthew had immediately wanted to take the words back. Is that what you want? I don't know, Matthew had admitted. I just don't want us to ruin what we have by trying to force something that isn't meant to boing. Adam had been quiet for a long moment, and when he'd spoken, his voice had been steady but sad. The words had hit Matthew like a physical blow, and he'd realized in that moment that the idea of losing Adam, of going back to being just friends, was infinitely more terrifying than any of the challenges they might face as a couple. No, he'd said quickly, reaching for Adam's hands. No, that's not what I want. I'm just scared, Adam. This is all new to me, and I don't want to mess it up. Adam's expression had softened, and he'd squeezed Matthew's hands gently. Quote 207. Quote 208. Matthew had said, feeling tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Quote 209. Quote 201. Adam had said firmly, pulling Matthew into his arms. Quote 210. Matthew had clung to him, had buried his face in Adam's neck, and had breathed in his familiar scent. Promise? I promise, Adam had whispered, holding him tighter. I promise we'll figure this out together. They'd talked for hours that night, had worked through their fears and insecurities, had reaffirmed their commitment to each other and to making their relationship work. By the time they'd gone to bed, Matthew had felt more secure in their connection than ever before. The days since then had been some of the happiest of Matthew's life. They'd settled into their new dynamic with increasing confidence, had started making plans for the future, had begun talking about things like moving in together officially and meeting each other's families as a couple. Quote 205. Adam had said, just yesterday as they had been making breakfast together, I want my parents to meet the person I'm in love with. The casual way he'd said it, the assumption that they would still be together months from now, had made Matthew's heart soar with happiness. I'd love that, he'd said, and had meant it completely. Now, sitting on their couch with Adam's arms around him, Matthew felt a sense of contentment he'd never experienced before. The fear was still there, would probably always be there to some degree, but it was manageable now, overshadowed by love and hope, and the certainty that they were building something beautiful together. Quote, Adam asked, pressing a kiss to Matthew's temple. Just how lucky I am, Matthew replies, turning in Adam's arms to face him. Adam smiles, that brilliant smile that never fails to make Matthew's heart race, and leans in to kiss him softly. I love you, he says against Matthew's lips. Quote, Matthew replies and settles back into Adam's embrace, feeling more at home than he ever has before. 3 months later, Matthew wakes up on a Saturday morning to the smell of coffee and bacon wafting from the kitchen. He stretches lazily, noting the empty space beside him in bed where Adam should be, and smiles at the domestic sounds coming from down the hall. This has become their routine on weekend mornings. Adam wakes up early and makes breakfast while Matthew sleeps in, and then they spend the morning eating together and planning their day. Matthew pulls on a t-shirt and pads barefoot to the kitchen, where he finds Adam standing at the stove, humming softly to himself as he tends to the bacon. He's wearing nothing but sleep pants and one of Matthew's old college t-shirts, and his hair is sticking up at odd angles in a way that makes Matthew's chest warm with affection. Quota 223, Matthew says, wrapping his arms around Adam's waist from behind and pressing a kiss to his neck. Morning, Adam replies, leaning back into Matthew's embrace. Quote to quote to Twisson, Matthew says, and means it completely. They've been officially together for 3 months now, and Matthew still sometimes can't believe this is his life, that he gets to wake up every morning next to the person he loves most in the world, that he gets to hold Adam freely and kiss him whenever he wants, that he gets to be loved back with the same intensity he's been carrying for so long. It hasn't all been smooth sailing. They've had their share of disagreements and growing pains as they've learned how to be in a romantic relationship after years of friendship. There have been moments of insecurity and doubt, times when they've had to work through jealousy or miscommunication, or the simple challenge of merging their lives more completely. But through it all, they have kept their promise to figure it out together. They've learned to communicate more openly, to address problems before they become bigger issues, to support each other through the inevitable challenges that come with any relationship. And with each obstacle they've overcome, their bond has only grown stronger. Quote 7. Adam says, turning in Matthew's arms to face him, maybe we should start looking for a bigger place. Matthew raises an eyebrow. Oh yeah, getting tired of me already? Adam laughs and swats at Matthew's chest playfully. Quote 30. The casual way Adam talks about their future together, the assumption that they'll be sharing a life for years to come, still makes Matthew's heart skip a beat. He says, leaning down to kiss Adam softly. Adam says against his lips, quote 203. Matthew pulls back to look at him with mock indignation. Quote 234, quote 230, Adam says with a grin, quote 236, quote 237. Matthew admits, unable to keep the smile off his face. Quote 238. They eat breakfast together at their small kitchen table, talking about their plans for the day and the week ahead. Adam has a work presentation on Monday that he's nervous about, and Matthew has promised to help him practice. Matthew has a deadline coming up for a freelance project, and Adam has already cleared his schedule to help with research if needed. This is what Matthew loves most about their relationship, the way they have seamlessly blended their lives together while still maintaining their individual identities. They support each other's goals and dreams, celebrate each other's successes, and provide comfort during setbacks. They become true partners in every sense of the word. Oh, I almost forgot, Adam says, reaching across the table to squeeze Matthew's hand. Matthew nods. Adam says firmly, 243. The word still sends a thrill through Matthew, even after 3 months. He's Adam's boyfriend. Adam is his. After years of loving from a distance, of watching Adam with other people and wishing things could be different, Matthew sometimes still can't quite believe it's real. Matthew admits, Adam reminds him. Adam stands up and moves around the table to where Matthew is sitting, settling onto his lap and wrapping his arms around his neck. He says softly. Matthew looks into Adam's green eyes and sees nothing but love and certainty there. After 3 months together, Adam has become an expert at soothing Matthew's anxieties, at reminding him that he's worthy of love and happiness, at helping him believe in their future together. I love you, Matthew says, because it's the only response that encompasses everything he's feeling. I love you too, Adam replies, and leans down to kiss him. Later that afternoon, they're curled up on their couch reading when Matthew's phone buzzes with a text message. He glances at it and sees it's from his sister, asking if he and Adam want to join her and her husband for dinner next weekend. Quote 253, Matthew says, showing Adam the message. Quote 254, Adam says, not looking up from his book. Quote 255, Matthew smiles at the casual way Adam includes himself in Matthew's family plans, the way he's seamlessly integrated into every aspect of Matthew's life. It's something Matthew never dared to hope for during all those years of secret longing, this sense of complete partnership and belonging. He texts Lisa back to confirm, and she responds immediately with excitement in a string of heart emojis. Matthew's family had been thrilled when he'd told them about his relationship with Adam, with his mother admitting she'd been hoping something would happen between them for years. I always thought you two were perfect for each other, she'd said during their last phone call. Matthew had been surprised by how easy it had been to come out to his family, how naturally they'd accepted his relationship with Adam. He'd spent so much time worrying about their reaction, building up scenarios in his head where they rejected him or didn't understand, that he'd been almost shocked by their enthusiastic support. Adam's family had been equally welcoming, treating Matthew like he'd always been part of the family, rather than making a big deal about the change in his relationship with their son. It had been one more confirmation that he and Adam were meant to be together, that their love was something worth celebrating rather than hiding. Quote 258. Adam asks, finally looking up from his book. Quote 259. Matthew says honestly. Adam's expression softens, and he reaches over to take Matthew's hand. Quote 260. Quote 261. Adam sets his book aside and shifts closer to Matthew on the couch, settling against his side with a contented sigh. Quote to 62, he says, quote is Sean. Matthew considers this, thinking about the Adam he'd known before they became a couple. He'd always been charismatic and outgoing, but there had been something restless about him, something unsettled. He'd gone through relationships quickly, had always seemed to be searching for something he couldn't quite define. Quote 260. Matthew agrees. Quote the shadow quote task. Adam says, so I quote Senora quoted 70. Adam turns to look at him with such love in his eyes that Matthew feels his breath catch. Quote 271. Matthew feels tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the simple truth of Adam's words. We were both blind, he says, but we found our way to each other eventually. We did, Adam agrees, and leans in to kiss him softly. As the afternoon fades into evening, they remain curled up together on the couch, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, sometimes just enjoying each other's presence in comfortable silence. This is what Matthew had dreamed of during all those lonely nights when he'd thought Adam could never be his. This sense of complete contentment, of being exactly where he belongs with exactly the right person. When it's time for bed, they go through their nighttime routine together, brushing their teeth side by side at the bathroom sink, changing into sleep clothes, settling into bed with the easy familiarity of a couple who've been together much longer than 3 months. Matthew sometimes marvels at how natural it all feels, how seamlessly they've transitioned from friends to lovers to partners. Quote 275. Adam says softly as they settle under the covers, his head on Matthew's chest and his arm draped across his waist. Yeah? Thank you. For what? For being brave enough to tell me the truth. For taking the risk of ruining our friendship to give us a chance at something more. I know it wasn't easy. Matthew runs his fingers through Adam's hair, marveling at the fact that he gets to touch him this way, that he gets to hold him every night and wake up beside him every morning. Matthew admits, Adam says, pressing a kiss to Matthew's chest. I'm so glad we found our way to each other. Me too, Matthew says, and means it with every fiber of his being. As they drift off to sleep together, Matthew reflects on the journey that brought them to this moment. The years of friendship, the months of confusion and longing, the terrifying moment of confession. The joy of discovering their feelings were mutual. It all seems like it was leading to this sense of complete rightness and belonging. He thinks about the conversation that started it all, about Adam asking him how you know when someone is right for you. Now Matthew knows the answer with absolute certainty. You know because being with them feels like coming home. You know because they make you want to be the best version of yourself. You know because you can't imagine your life without them in it. You know because when you look at them, you see your future reflected back at you, and it's more beautiful than anything you ever dared to dream. Matthew had spent so many years believing that his love for Adam was hopeless, that he was destined to watch from the sidelines as Adam found happiness with someone else. He'd resigned himself to a life of loving from a distance, of being grateful for whatever scraps of attention and affection he could get. But sometimes, Matthew thinks as he holds Adam close and listens to his steady breathing, sometimes the universe surprises you. Sometimes the person you love most in the world turns out to love you back just as much. Sometimes the friendship you're afraid to risk turns out to be the foundation for the greatest love story of your life. I love you, Matthew whispers into the darkness, even though Adam is already asleep. Adam stirs slightly, tightening his hold on Matthew. Love you too, he mumbles. And Matthew smiles at the automatic response, at the way Adam's love for him has become as natural as breathing. As Matthew finally drifts off to sleep, He feels a sense of profound gratitude wash over him. For Adam's love, for their friendship that became something more, for the courage they both found to take the leap into the unknown. For all the mornings he'll wake up beside the person he loves, for all the evenings they'll spend curled up together on their couch, for all the adventures and challenges and quiet moments they'll share in the years to come. He told Adam that he didn't feel right around anyone else, that Adam was his exception to everything. What he hadn't said, but what he knows with absolute certainty now is that Adam isn't just his exception, he's his everything, his best friend, his partner, his home, his future, the person who makes him feel complete in a way he never thought possible. And as Matthew falls asleep in Adam's arms, he knows that no matter what challenges they might face in the future, they'll face them together. Because they have already overcome the biggest obstacle of all, the fear of losing each other. They have learned that some risks are worth taking, that some love stories are worth fighting for, that sometimes the most beautiful relationships grow from the strongest friendships. They've learned that when you find your person, your exception, your home in another human being, you hold on tight and never let go. And that's exactly what Matthew intends to do for the rest of his life. In the quiet of their shared bedroom, with Adam's steady breathing beside him and the promise of tomorrow stretching out before them, Matthew finally understands what it means to be truly, completely, perfectly happy. He's found his exception, and his exception has found him, and together they've built something beautiful and lasting and real. Sometimes the most frightening confessions lead to the most beautiful discoveries, and sometimes the person you've been looking for has been right beside you all along, waiting for you both to be brave enough to see what was always meant to be.